Hey yo, there was once a time when everybody believed in at least some form of God, and religion ruled the world. It was called the Dark Ages.
Alright, here we go again. We're starting off with the assumption that atheists are correct and there is no God. So, start out, good versus evil, which is defined by a magical sky being. Well, if that's the case, then it's subjective anyway. You claim that good and evil must be objective and that without God they're subjective. But that's not the case, because with God, morality is subjective to God's whims. And he's been shown to change. Just look at the Bible. In the Old Testament, he was an overbearing, vicious, vile, tyrannical dictator, and in the New Testament, he was a homeless hippie. So, not only is it not absolute, it's not objective. However, in a world without a God, there is objective morality. I personally can objectively see whether I am causing suffering or not. Empathy exists, and assuming that God doesn't exist, as we're doing for the sake of this argument, empathy still exists without God, and empathy is an objective point of reference from which to base one's morality. Regardless, belief based upon your dislike of a situation doesn't make your belief true. You might not like the fact that morality isn't dictated to you by a magical sky being. It does not make that magical sky being a reality. It simply is your own personal distaste of the situation. In addition to morality, you spoke of meaning. That's completely worthless anyway. The reason it's completely worthless is because with or without a God, you still make your own personal subjective meaning anyway. You go from church to church until you find one that has the Spirit of God in it or whatever. You don't just go to whatever church is closest to you. You go to the church that you feel is the best. You accept the teachings of your pastor that you agree with. You take the parts of the Bible that you like and live by them. So the meaning to your life is subjective whether or not there's a God. You talk about genes and environment. Well, there's no free will because we're a product of our genes and our environment. Two factors to that. Number one, neither genes nor environment guarantee anything. There's a combination of the two, including your life's experiences, which are considered part of your environment for scientific purposes. So while it can be said that it's genes and environment, there are aspects of your environment that aren't related to what you're talking about. From the gene itself, to the chemicals that regulate what that gene does, to the experiences that you incorporate into your decisions, you are still a product of your genes and your environment. And that still goes for you, even if there is a God, because you are physically, physiologically, biologically what God made you to be. The genes that he put in you are still enacted upon by the chemicals in your environment, by your surroundings, etc., and by your experiences. And just because those experiences include church does not change the fact that that's part of your environment. So you are a product of your genes and your environment. If you can still have free will, despite your genes and your environment, then you can do that without the need for God to be there. Then you talk about great art. Again, we know that art happens, regardless of what people believe. And again, we're making the assumption for the sake of the video, as you stated, if you're right, that's the premise of the video that I'm responding to, then art doesn't need to be inspired by a fictitious man, because it happens anyway. Just because you disagree with somebody doing something like taking a jar of piss and putting a crucifix in it, which I have to admit, other than the fact that it's hilarious to watch Christians get offended at it, I think is a substandard piece of artwork anyway. You know, or when somebody slices a cow into cross sections and puts them inside of giant jars of formaldehyde and things of that nature, that's simply the topic that they're talking about. It has nothing to do with whether or not there's a God. Again, it's not evidence of anything other than the fact that art exists. If you wish to establish God as a fact through this particular argument, you must first establish that men have to be inspired by a magical sky being before you can state that art is proof that God exists. And then you talk about holiness. Completely meaningless. Holiness is a religious concept. period. And it's a religious concept that, despite the attempt to make it defined as something good, in actuality and in practice, it tends to simply be, well, God made me holy, so I'm better than you. That type of an attitude in Christians. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it's completely worthless. Holiness, to me, is nothing more than a synonym for arrogance. So, while that might make me holy, that makes you way holy, Brock. Then you talk about human rights. That human rights can't be conferred by chemicals, by molecules, by whatever. But with God, there are no human rights. God didn't specify any specific human rights. There's no human rights labeled anywhere in the Bible. And in fact, what the Bible does talk about is that it's okay to have slaves. It's okay to commit genocide, so long as the people that you're killing off don't worship Him. It's okay to do all sorts of things that are absolutely against human rights, that we, as the author of human rights, go against. So if you want to talk about human rights, that's fine, but talk about it in the context of where it is. The church itself condones slavery until people as a whole, objectively, regardless of their religions, respective religions, because there's been groups and groups of people in different countries, began to outlaw slavery, realizing that we are people and that all people are people. Until then, the church viewed slavery as okay, so long as the people you were enslaving are people who you consider to be subhuman from a racist standpoint, typically Native Americans and Africans, and in the case of the English, the Indians. So basically anybody who has dark skin, according to God's human rights, is okay to be enslaved. According to the Bible directly, the way that it states it, you can take a slave so long as that slave doesn't agree with what magical sky man you believe in. So, quite frankly, nothing you said in your video actually means anything at all. And then you want to talk about which God is it? It's the God of the Israelites, or it's the God of the Founding Fathers? Well, being that the Founding Fathers were deists, which God is it, Brock? You mentioned two of them. You mentioned two separate ones of it. You'll notice that the Founding Fathers did not mention Jesus anywhere in any of their in any of our legal documentation. And if you dig through their quotes, you'll find that several of them were actually opposed to Christianity because of the atrocities that God commits in the Bible, and because of the atrocities that Christians at the time were committing on other people. So I don't see how you can state that the God of Israel is the God inscribed on the Liberty Bell and all this other crap. Maybe you need to get an education, Brock. In fact, there's no maybe about it. You need to get an education, Brock.
Hey, yo. There was once a time when everybody believed in at least some form of God, and religion ruled the world. It was called the Dark Ages.